This is the Federal Mobility Policy Update with Jessica Wehrman from Congressional Quarterly Roll Call, Beth Osborne from Transportation for America, Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative, and Darryl Young from the Summit Foundation. With the House's passage of a $3.5 trillion budget plan, what does it mean for biking, walking, transit, and electric vehicles? Is it enough? How does this bill relate to the flawed bipartisan infrastructure bill that the Senate just passed? Is it too late to fix the Senate's poor treatment of transit? All that and more on this week's edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. This week, so much to unpack. As you know, the House passed a $3.5 trillion budget on transportation and other matters. With us to unpack all this and to explain what does it mean for transportation is Jessica Wehrman from Congressional Quarterly Roll Call. Hi, Jessica.
How are you?
Great.
Thanks for having me.
And we've got Beth Osborne from Transportation for America. Hi, Beth.
Hi.
And we've got Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative. And I'm Darryl Young from the Summit Foundation. This week, let's talk a little bit about what's been happening on the Hill. So much has happened around the $3.5 trillion budget proposal after there was some disagreement upon the Democrats themselves about how to move this. It suddenly did move thanks to the work of Nancy Pelosi and others. What happened? And let's go over our quick hits as we normally do. Let's start with Beth. Beth, what are your quick hits for this week?
Sure. As you mentioned, the House passed their budget resolution. They had to do some negotiating between moderates and liberals to push it through. And the deal was theoretically to separate the infrastructure package vote from a budget reconciliation vote. But the votes are expected about the same time anyway, towards the end of September. And in reality, it's going to be both of them or neither of them. The second thing is advocates are working really hard on restoring the $10 billion that was taken out of the bipartisan infrastructure deal, promised when the breakthrough was announced in late June. And then as they wrote the bill, it just they bled out transit dollars. And so we're looking to work with the House to restore them. Great.
Jessica, what have you been hearing and learning about?
Well, we have a date for a markup for reconciliation. So part 2 of this grand infrastructure adventure we're on this summer comes September 14th when the T&I marks up its portion of the reconciliation bill, which is massive and goes across committees. You name the committee and probably has a hand in this. So I'll be watching what's in the T&I portion, how much of it is actually T and how much of it is I. What are the things, because, you know, the committee has jurisdiction over a ton of stuff. So like federal buildings, for example. So what is the transportation elements of this? What are we going to see that maybe didn't get into the earlier bill? Secondarily, and linked to that, I'm interested in how does Peter DeFazio, who's the chairman of this committee, get the things that he has wanted? He called for a transformational infrastructure bill when he passed the Invest in America Act on July 1st in the House. That was what he wanted. He wanted to really change the way we move. He expressed a lot of disappointment in the Senate bipartisan package. So how can he possibly get what he wants in this reconciliation measure? And how does he do that given sort of the weird and arbitrary rules? And I feel like I can say that sort of objectively because they are very unusual rules for reconciliation. Things like there are policy things you can't really do. You can't do a lot of things with reconciliation. So how does he thread that needle? That's my second. It's not a very quick hit, so sorry about that.
No, it's important to know.
My long hit.
Yeah. Let's unpack all of that. And let's talk a little bit about what's in the budget for transportation. We'll start with Beth, and then we'll toss it to Jessica, and then Martha, chime in on questions that as we start to look at what does this package look like.
Well, it's not really clear what's going to be in reconciliation for transportation. There's a lot of concern on the part of particularly folks in the Senate that if transportation issues are addressed in reconciliation, it will look like going back on the infrastructure deal. I think that's a hard argument to make when you didn't fulfill your deal in reconciliation. They promised $49 billion extra dollars for transit. They only delivered on $39 billion. They promised $7 billion in electrification dollars for transit. They only supplied $5 billion of that, or $7.5 billion went to $5 billion. So just actually restoring that is what is necessary to meet the deal that the senators and the White House touted to everyone with such pride. And then there are some very interesting provisions in the budget reserving funding for climate and for transportation, and it's not clear how that can be used. But it does seem like Chairman DeFazio is pretty excited to figure that out and to push the envelope. So we will see, and we're going to continue to work to see that the transit dollars are there, and maybe that some of those transit dollars go to operations to ensure that transit agencies can even use the capital dollars. In the Recovery Act, a lot of agencies struggled to justify buying new buses if they couldn't find or afford to pay for the drivers to run them. And we're seeing similar issues now. It's hard to build new expansions, new extensions of transit systems if you're having trouble operating your existing system. So making sure that we're supporting transit through the rest of this, time of transition and COVID will be important if we want to see those dollars spent.
Great. Jessica, what popped out to you regarding transportation funding, specifically for biking, walking, transit, and even EVs? EVs didn't get everything that they wanted. They did get some. You hear a lot of politicians talking about like somehow EVs are a magic elixir. Well, we're supporting climate. Here's money for EVs. Could you unpack a little bit about the actual money in dollars? Are there strings attached to that, or how does that look?
That's what they do September 14th. Right now, what they have is basically, from what I understand, a dollar figure. I believe it's like $60 billion. That sounds about right. And they also have this sort of, again, needle to thread, because they have this sort of, I guess, handshake agreement with between Biden and the bipartisan negotiators that we're not going to pay for stuff we already paid for. So the dilemma becomes, how do you manage to pay for the stuff you want to pay for while kind of meeting this handshake agreement? Now, what DeFazio seems to have landed on, and I'll be interested in seeing how he follows through, is creating new programs. Because they didn't fund the program if it's new. And even if those programs are sort of on a theme, for example, transit related, you could still abide by that handshake agreement and have, say, a new transit related program that is funded under the $60 billion. So I think that's how he gets around that. The other thing I'm kind of curious about is how he does earmarks. Earmarks are usually verboten under reconciliation rules. He seems to think he has a way to get those funded. I will be very curious to see what sort of magic he can work to make that happen.
Yeah, let's talk a little more about Peter DeFazio. He was a bike mechanic once, so he has come up through the transportation world in a very interesting way. But yeah, it seems like he put together and introduced a really very progressive, it's the transportation bill I think we need for this country moving forward. He's obviously not going to get all of everything he wanted from that, everything they laid out. But what are you seeing with Peter DeFazio? He's a very interesting character, isn't he?
Yes. And he's very quotable, which reporters always like. So the interesting thing about him, he is a very, you have 435 people, you get all in the House, you get all types. But DeFazio is a really interesting guy to cover because he really is very, very passionate about this issue. He's worked on it. He was a former county commissioner. He came here wanting to do transportation infrastructure stuff. He's been working on it since like 1987. If you talk to his fellow lawmakers, Republican and Democrat, they will say he has a staffer level knowledge of this issue. You can really try to stump him and you cannot. You can talk to him about the wonkiest, nerdiest stuff and he usually has something to say on it, and something to say that's like a very firm opinion too. So this has been, I like to cover politics, I like to cover policy, but to me, sort of the people behind them and sort of how they operate is probably the most interesting part of what I do for a living. And with DeFazio, you really got the sense of someone with extremely high hopes that this bill would affect change in the way we move, affect change in climate change. And remember, he's from Oregon. There was a huge heat dome over Oregon that was like killing people. That was really, I mean, he took that very personally and justifiably so. I mean, his people were legitimately hurting because of the impact of climate change. So he saw in this bill, in his House version of this bill, an opportunity to really make transformative change. And then the Senate bipartisan group kind of bypassed him. I mean, he kind of got rolled. And so to me, one of the stories is how does he get his way in this? How does he get at least close to transformational change, if not exactly? I mean, and he's also been here since 1987. He knows, like, this is not his first rodeo. He knows he's not going to get everything he wants. But how does he get more of what he wants? How does he get to a place where at the end of the day, he is satisfied that he has made the impact that he wants to make on transportation policy?
Beth, any insight on Mr. DeFazio?
DeFazio comes from a very interesting district. It does include, pretty liberal areas. Like I think he's got Eugene and Bend in his district. But then he has really, really rural Oregon, which is Alabama. I mean, this is not cutting edge areas. These are very old fashioned, very conservative areas.
Hey, let's not look down on Alabama, okay? Let's give Alabama some love, okay?
All I said was old fashioned. So as an LSU fan, I had plenty to say about
All right.
Anyway, so it's not an area that necessarily it would produce the calls for the same progressive things that some other areas of his district calls for. His bill, I don't actually consider it to be progressive. I consider it to be very focused on accountability, which is completely absent from the transportation program. Now, some of the things he's seeking accountability for are progressive issues like climate. That's definitely progressive. But I would love to find the conservative that says they don't believe in safety, that's only a progressive issue. And I think that's really unfair to claim that that's only a progressive issue. I would also love to see which conservative thinks that repairing broken infrastructure is only a progressive issue. And frankly, progressives don't have a good history on that. So I think he's gotten frustrated with what our program has repeatedly failed to produce and has gone full bore accountability. And getting that out of the Senate bill is a complete impossibility, because what the Senate bill says and what the senators themselves have said is that their goal is giving the states flexibility to not be accountable, to have worse repair results, to have more deadly roadways. That flexibility is the priority. So where do you go from there? And I will say, DeFazio, who inherited the mantle of updating this program from Oberstar, another person with encyclopedic knowledge of transportation and the program and French and all kinds of other things, takes this very seriously. But I also think he's just tired of voting on packages over and over with no change. And so he's going to get real creative, and he's going to do his best both in reconciliation but also in implementation to make sure he gets as much accountability going forward as he can.
So the question I would ask is, the process seemed to have passed him by in the Senate, and they ignored him. What I hear both of you saying is that the playing field is a little bit leveled. To what extent is Nancy Pelosi going to give him that running room? To what extent is the Biden administration going to play along and give DeFazio and other progressives that running room necessary to try to shift or improve it? Or is there going to be a reluctance by the Biden administration to look at all of this? Do you have any insight on that?
I don't think that it is level. I think there's opportunity, but it's nowhere close to level. any opportunity for a non-status quo bill was killed by the bipartisan deal and the White House. And the White House seems to have left DOT out of negotiations specifically because getting a deal was more important than creating a better program. So that's what we're up against. I mean, that's just the fact. And DeFazio is going to get creative to find as much opportunity as he can because he is dogged and a true believer in this level of accountability. But his options are limited because you can't do policy and reconciliation. So it's going to be a challenge.
It's interesting that they sort of cut the Secretary, US DOT, out of a lot of these conversations. And yet the Senate bill gives US DOT, what was the figure, Jessica? $105 billion.
Yeah, he has huge discretionary authority. So there is some room to exercise what Biden has called his priorities. So that will be interesting. I mean, and you can't make things like equity parts, one of the justifications for receiving a grant. You can make, does this project address climate change? It's not bill. I mean, it's something, like, I guess, is half a loaf better than no loaf at all? And it's an extraordinary amount of discretionary money. So there is that. I would also say that when you talked about Nancy Pelosi versus Biden, actually the real big thing, if you're talking strictly about reconciliation, is the Senate and the Byrd rule and the Senate parliamentarian who has to implement this rule that DeFazio lovingly calls the dead guy rule, because it's named after Robert Byrd, who died in 2010. It's a parliamentary rule that basically says that you can't do policy with reconciliation, you can't do things that are non-germane, and that's a kind of huge umbrella. So I would say that actually the Senate is kind of the big thing that sort of stands in the path. Now, you can overrule a parliamentarian, and that's what he's hoping that the Senate does. If they just say, yeah, thanks for your insight, but we're going to do what we want. So the question is, does the Senate have the fortitude to exercise DeFazio's will? I mean, there's a lot of dominoes that have to fall a very specific way for him to get what he wants. So
is that a decision that Schumer would have to make in overruling the parliamentarian?
I mean, Schumer would have to have a coalition agreeing to do it all.
Yeah,
they would have to have the Manchin-Sanders agreement. Mm-hmm. So...
Yeah,
this is going to be fun. I mean, it is going to be very interesting to watch.
All right.
And I really brushed up on my reconciliation. Like, the Senate rules actually become kind of a thing.
Well, and I think Jessica's right. Like, what the parliamentarian does with this is not clear because the rules aren't clear. Mm-mm. So it's really a human being passing judgment. Who knows where it's going to land? We have no idea.
DeFazio says he has to have a seance. The parliamentarian has to have a seance with Robert Byrd. So I'm telling you, this man is a very interesting man to quote. So, you could just, yeah.
In Portland, they say put a bird on it. It sounds like people are putting a bird on everything.
They call it the bird bath too. It's whoever says covering Congress is boring just doesn't really understand.
So you've got to know who to talk to.
Yeah, the deep policy wonks can pull out the popcorn for the next month or so and see where things go. So I want to pivot a little bit to a different question. Jessica, you said you've been covering transportation since 2019, so fairly new to the transportation space. Yeah, and Beth, you were talking about how coverage has changed. So let's talk a little bit about what's it like covering transportation? What are you seeing when you come into this sort of with fairly fresh eyes? And Beth, what are you seeing from doing this for a really long time? We have the veteran and the freshman, fresh woman, fresh.
I like to think I'm a sophomore by now.
Sophomore, yes.
Pandemic and all the aid. So I feel like I'm graduated.
And you got the lingo, right? Have you got the acronyms down?
Yeah, that took a minute.
Yeah. The 10-page list of transportation acronyms.
Yeah. And I still have to double check because sometimes I throw an extra letter into some of these places. I'm like, oh no.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I will start by saying there have been some new reporters like Jessica who've come into the space and with some intellectual curiosity, and that's really changed things. because finally we have reporters asking questions like, okay, so we're talking about $1 trillion in spending, but for what? To do what? What will be the result? What happened? Why? And we've never had that before. So that's been really exciting and a lot more informative and frankly a lot more interesting. Sometimes I think that the only reason this bill can be bipartisan is no one's asked to think at all about what it is. And it's really the only issue where that's the case. So I've just seen, the newer folks not phoning it in. I mean, a lot of the old reporting was, there's a debate about this number. Oh, they broke through on the debate about this number. Oh, the number is done. Oh, the number's being spent. And that's literally all the coverage. That is not the case with a lot of reporters. And it really is because of the sorts of folks like Jessica who've come into the scene.
It's interesting how many people on Capitol Hill now got their start as a transportation reporter, which is interesting because I'm 20. I don't want to half count the rings. I mean, I've been here a very, very long time covering stuff in Capitol Hill. And so this is not a new, I'm not doing this as a novice. I'm doing this coming in after 20 years of covering Ohio for Capitol Hill. What's interesting is they do have that sort of fundamental knowledge, but you do have, Beth is right, you do have to kind of ask the questions. When the bipartisan negotiators first came out and said, yay, we've reached this agreement, they came out with a 2-page like a front and back piece and said, this is the agreement. And basically it was like a bunch of numbers, like X for transit, X. And that's kind of hard. That sort of asks more questions. That sort of raises more questions than it answers, right? So the question, and at the end of the day, it was not really what the agreement looked like. At the end of the day, one of the key agreements over transit wasn't really, that was one of the big holdups on this thing. So the nuance is really important. I like to think of transportation like education. Everyone's for it, right? Yay, we love kids. Let's educate. But it's not really like that. It's all very theoretical. Theoretically, we all like to be able to get from point A to point B. But there's so much nuance below that sort of top level. Education. I could think of 100 different arguments about education. Should we be, sending vouchers, you name it. And transportation is similarly thematically, yeah, we're for it. We want to move goods and products and people and be able to do that expediently and efficiently. And that helps us. But there's so much under there. And that's the thing that I'm tasked with doing, is to try to figure out, what is the philosophy behind this? What is something we can all get behind? And then now that you have sort of climate change added to that, that's definitely a very important layer.
Are you finding that the sophistication of members of Congress is getting deeper? So it's not just the amount of money that comes to my district, but I have this light rail vehicle, or I have or I have this bus lane I want to put in, or bike lane I want to put in. Is that have both of you found that the level of sophistication among members of Congress and their staff have improved?
It kind of depends on the member. Really, we're looking at 435. That's, you find me 435 people and I'll find you 435 different levels of knowledge, opinion, et cetera. So there are some who are very nuanced about it, who understand it. Actually, one of the things that really surprised me was Amtrak is a truly bipartisan issue.
Oh, yeah.
Long distance rail was you want to find, that's actually one of the places where you really do see, it's kind of like covering ag, where it's sort of, if you have long distance rail in your district you care about, just like if you're from a dairy area, dairy becomes extremely important. Yeah. I saw yeah. So, that was kind of interesting to me to see that's very, now transit is still, it kind of surprises me how, partisan an issue that is. And it kind of reflects the larger, in some ways, Republican and Democrat the rural-urban divide. You see Republicans sort of living in one kind of area of the country and Democrats living in one area. And as a result, transit has surprised me. I've been watching Senate Banking Committee hearings for months now. There have been several on transit where the only Republican who shows up, even by Zoom, is Pat Toomey. because he's the ranking Republican. That
Right.
says to me about a level of prioritization among the party. Now, Beth, you
Yeah.
can feel free to disagree, but
No, I really do agree on so much of that. I will say, in terms of knowledge, I think we've got three different buckets of members. You've got the truly knowledgeable. That's rare. I mean, Peter DeFazio. There's a group on the House side now that really get into the weeds. Hank Johnson, Chuy Garcia. There's like that crew that really deeply cares. That's rare. There's not a lot of those. And frankly, the trust fund makes that hard. It only comes up every 6 years. How much of an expert, how much time are you going to put into something? So that's a problem. Two is those who know that there's a problem with this program, but don't put any energy into fixing it, will vote for whatever comes up, even if they know it will make problems. The Senate's full of that, particularly on the Democrat side. And then there are people that just don't know because it doesn't come up enough to learn. And that's continuously a problem. And I think for those of us, in the advocacy community, our job over the next year is to bring every problem back to those people who happily and ignorantly voted for this thing and ask why they tolerated this, to start to break that sense that this is without consequence. But I'll also say the bipartisanship behind Amtrak was hard fought. No one really saw it happen, but when I was on Capitol Hill in Senator Carper's office, we created a new approach to Amtrak that really brought along that bipartisanship. And it's because we went in deep on those long distance lines and protecting those lines from the Class 1 rails that were blocking them and making them not work. And there's still a problem, but we gave some power. On transit, we as a community and as a nation have permitted folks who represent rural America to say rural Americans don't deserve or want transit without knowing a thing about it. We've got some of the largest no household counties are rural. And when you hear these rural reps say rural America doesn't want or need it, they're saying that they just don't care about those people who have no other way to get around. And
that's right.
But there's a reason rural America has lost population again in this census. And it's not because they were super happy to not have transit or any way to get to the hospital.
Right.
So I think that we need to call rural reps on that. But I think we also need to go much deeper on rural transit and not just have a smaller version of urban transit paid for in rural areas, but do a real rural transit program.
That's right. For people outside in the rural areas and outside the Beltway, who should we be reading and following? Both naturally, we should subscribe to Roll Call and the specialized inside services. But what other reporters should we be subscribing to on Twitter and other places? Who do both of you also read and triangulate off of?
Oh, I'm so interested to know what Jessica says.
Well, and there are committed transportation teams. David Shepardson, I can't remember where he's at. Reuters. He's Reuters, right?
I think so.
I follow, and I'm trying to think of who all I'm screwing up this question, so I'm trying to think of where to even start.
Well, Sam Mintz is someone that I follow, right?
What's that, Sam?
Mintz.
Politico has a team of people. Yeah, Politico has a whole team of people. But I also try to read some of, the other sort of specialized newsletters that focus on, and I cover transportation sort of writ large. So that also means, for example, last year I was doing a lot of stuff on airlines and airline workers, the payroll support program. So I kind of cover the waterfront for transit. It's a huge beat. I follow the transit folks, transport topics. They do trucking stuff, but they also will focus on things like nominees. So, it's almost a hard question to ask. I feel like I kind of fumbled it, sort of.
That's right.
I always struggle too, because it is a long list, and I'll always leave folks out. But Ian Duncan at the Washington Post has done some extraordinary work. And what's wrong? Oh, Emily Badger isn't necessarily a transportation reporter, but some of her coverage of transportation and growth has just been off the charts. Also, Brad Plumer there has been incredible. Liam Dillon, who's now with the LA Times, does some really great work. Alyssa Walker with Curve. I mean, I could go on. There's just some great folks. And honestly, the last time I did reauthorization, I had no such list.
And some of them aren't necessarily transport reporters. I always follow Eric Lawson because he's always on the Hill and he always is very plugged in. And he knows about this issue. This is not like so I follow him. And it's kind of good to know general breaking stuff too, because he does cover the waterfront as well. So it's kind of hard to choose. It's like,
I know I probably left out
all of the ice cream.
We'll put all those links in the show notes, and if you've got others, both of you, go ahead and send them to me before I put this video up, and we'll make sure that other people can follow them, because both of you are so good at keeping us informed and via print in both your journalism and your advocacy, Beth. And we certainly want to enlarge the knowledge level, so as readers and consumers of this information, we become more sophisticated to match your sophistication of coverage. Martha, I'll turn it to you.
All right. I think we need to wrap up. It's been lovely chatting with you, Jessica, and Beth, and Darryl, as always. So we wrap up with just a different question. And the question today is, what have you been watching on TV? What's your escape? What's your guilty pleasure? Where do you go when you turn your transportation brain off? Beth.
So we've been on a Marvel tear this summer, and we watched WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where finally a Louisianan becomes Captain America. Yes. Then Loki, and now we're watching What If, which is a cartoon version using all the actual actors' voices. But like, what if T'Challa was kidnapped by the folks who took Star-Lord and became Star-Lord and things like that. And it's really fun.
Okay, Jessica.
I'm a Ted Lasso fan, and I feel like that's such a 2021 answer. And so I'm a little bit like, I love that show. My whole family when they launch it on Fridays, we're like, okay, let's watch this thing. I have teenagers; they have way better things to do, but they choose to watch Ted Lasso with me. I need that warm fuzzy in my life. It's 2021. I've got to put my mask back on. I'm a little annoyed by that. So, I'll just watch these soccer players being warm and fuzzy, and also don't tell my husband, but I have a little crush on Roy Kent because he's just grumpy, and he's grumpy with a heart of gold. And, yeah. And I think my husband actually knows, but
he's okay with that. Yeah. Darryl.
So I discovered that there's a free streaming service called Pluto, which has its own Star Trek channel, which it runs 24 hours a day episodes of Star Trek. Then I've also I subscribe.
I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, it's Pluto. It's great. And then I also have been watching Lower Decks, which is an animated cartoon, which has a great sense of humor around and the person who's the red shirt on that cartoon is always dying. So it's a great show, Lower Decks. So we have to jump off to go watch our shows. Wait, what is your show? I'm sorry, Martha.
What about me?
Yes, what is your show? Sorry.
So we've been working through the Star Wars canon. So, Bad Batch just
a lot of sci-fi in this crowd, right?
Yeah. And so now we're back to like Star Wars Rebels. We're working through the series, which are sometimes annoying, but sometimes really pretty good. Can't wait till the next issue of The Mandalorian comes out. That's where we're at.
Okay.
Well,
we're looking forward to seeing more of that on the Disney Plus channel, and another streaming service.
We need them to sponsor us, apparently.
We're going to get them to sponsor this. Yes, we're going to get them to sponsor this, and we're going to get Amazon to sponsor this as well, and Netflix. So I want to thank our panelists. As always, Martha Roskowski, thank you for being a panelist and informing the conversation. Beth Osborne, from Transportation for America. Again, thank you so much. And Jessica Wellman from Wehrman. Sorry.
I know, it's one of those
My
Euromut names. It's very hard to.
Jessica Wehrman from Congressional Quarterly's Roll Call. Thank you so much. If you like this show, like and subscribe on YouTube. Smash that button. And we'll be back next week with more information around what's happening on transportation in the Beltway. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.